So I wanted to start something, just what I thought was a bit of a humorous anecdote, but still is salient to our overall discussion. And I was watching a Jordan Peterson interview the other day, where at one point, of course, as is his wont, he's talking about social structures, and he's relating it to Jesus Christ being a carpenter. Now, this had something to do with the middle class or whatever, but ultimately the idea of him being a carpenter, in his opinion, was that if you were a dishonest person, then that would be evident in your work, right? And I was like, clearly you've never worked with contractors before, was my first thought, because I was a project coordinator back in the day. So, but that being said, it immediately got me to thinking, why a carpenter? What was this about? I've contemplated this a lot over the years, and my thoughts have often changed. But ultimately, it's because the nature of a carpenter is to repurpose a raw material. So something is destroyed, like a tree, it's cut down, then it's repurposed into lumber, which is then repurposed into chairs and furnishings and houses and stuff. The other reason is that if you have a carpenter, this is someone who can, in fact, build your house, right? And then the house that you are building will be the house of the Lord. So hence the idea of a carpenter being in place. But I was fascinated with the idea of carpentry also being representative of transmutation, that I take a tree and I turn it into a desk, you know, like it's completely altered. You know, there's still the substance of the tree in there. I can see the wood grain and whatnot, but the essence of what it once was has been fundamentally altered by me. I have taken it in one state and made another. Another possible thing you could have chosen for the savior image would be a chef, right? Because, you know, you're taking various elements, destroying them as they are in their current state and recombining them to make something new, like an omelet. So in the meantime, I've had to harvest a bunch of plants, take care of some chicken eggs, you know, maybe get some dairy products and convert those from raw dairy product into cheese, another transmutive thing that we do. And so I sat and thought about that and recognized that the role of the Lord is in Tipperet, and how this relates to what we're talking about is that it follows in line with the symbols associated with each of the elements in succession as we work our way down. Before we get to that though, I want to point out something about the tree. And let's take a peek here. Okay. So when we look at the tree, when we're looking at the tree of life, and we're considering it as the subject or articulation of how the universe operates, how we can look at it and go, okay, this is the universe brought into stages, and then we can meditate on what those stages are and use them as a means of inferring what is going on. Okay, when we look at the tree, the only purely masculine aspect, the only purely sacred masculine aspect on the tree is in fact Keter. And Keter technically doesn't reside on the tree, but is above the tree. Keter is known as the crown. So the crown sits above the head. Therefore, Keter is the force of force, the force of energy, the force of consciousness, translating from the unmanifest into the manifest universe. And therefore, that manifestation, that first swirling, that initial eruption of whatever that becomes into everything, right? But in the beginning, it's really nothing. But it becomes something almost immediately upon its translation. that is the only purely sacred masculine force. Every single point below that on the tree is defaults first to sacred feminine and then to sacred masculine. And this then, and this is reflected even in our own biology. So as a child is conceived and developed within the womb, it develops first feminine, and then after some hormonal input from mom, it becomes masculine. So it's the idea and the importance of this is that we in Malkut then have defaulted by de facto, all of us, regardless of who we are, we default immediately to receptive and resistant. And really, it's resistant and then receptive. And so it's the process of working through that then allows us to adopt a sacred masculine principle once we receive that inflow that allows us then to work upward. And every working upward is a working toward a restoration of oneness with the initial emanation in Keter. Okay? I wanted to point that out because as we discuss the symbols associated with each of these four worlds, each of the four worlds, so in Absolute, in Braya, in Yetzirah, and Malkut, we can understand how the energy or energetic output is actually working. So we can see and visualize that flow and then adopt the flow for ourselves. When we look at the tree then, before I go any farther, any thoughts or questions? We good? Awesome. All right.
Totally with you.
Oh, totally with it. Excellent. Riding along here. So let's take a look then at the symbols which are associated with the tree and with the four elements that represent the four worlds and the tetragrammaton, which is the sacred name of God, of the all, right? So the tetragrammaton is the Yod, He, Vav, He. That's the four-letter name, tetra, four, right? Grammaton, letter. So the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of the all, or the divine. The Yod, He, Vav, He represents the sequential progression of manifestation through various degrees. And we use these symbols that we have today. We use the symbols of the rod or the wand, the cup, the sword, and the disc or the pentacle to represent those forces. This is not going to be the class where you're like, okay, so we're going to talk about the element itself on a more elementary level. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to seek the connection, the primal reason behind why a cup is chosen to represent the element of water. Why does a sword bear significance within the domain of Yetzirah? And why a disc, which is something of a two-dimensional status, is representative of the plane of the earth. So with that said, let's take a look at our picture here. This particular one has converted it to ordinary playing card status. So clubs equal wands, right, in the tarot. Hearts equal cups. Spades equal swords. And diamonds equal pentacles. And there are a couple of videos I did a few years ago where I discuss the nature of a spade and the nature of each of these elements relative to what they conjure within your mind. This time, what we want to do is we want to look at the nature of these elements and ask ourselves, and I'm going to ask you guys now, so I'm prepping you, why? Why is wood? Why is a wooden wand tied to the element of fire? Beyond the fact that it burns. Why else would it be tied to the element of fire? What do you think, Horace? I know I put you on the spot.
That's a tough one.
It
That's a
is.
tough one.
I actually had to meditate on this one for a long period of time. The thing that might help is that many times when you see a wand depicted, it's like this right here in the image. It's showing a leafy green emanation. And so the question then is, why are wands often exhibited with leaves, or why are the leaves themselves on fire beyond the fact that they burn? So I'm going to bail you guys out. The reason for this is associated with the nature of wood. And what we get between the discussion of discs, which are pentacles, discs, which is earth, and wands, is we get a representation of two factors of universal expression. One which contains memory, and the other which contains the conduit through which consciousness is conducted. Okay, the force of all creative force. And the way to think of this is, what is the primal cause for growth in any tree or plant? It is in fact light. It's sunlight. Sunlight creates the photosynthesis necessary for it to grow. Even things which are subterrestrial or grow in the earth still require the sun's light to heat the earth to a particular temperature so that they're conducive to growth. So the light of the sun then is associated with the power of fire and growth, the fire that quickens from within, which is why it's also tied, why fire in that element is also tied with spirit, right? I have the fire of the spirit upon me, right? The idea of to be inspired is to experience a passion, and a passion is an emotional elevated state of ecstasy, right? Which is evocative of fire. When someone says they have a fire within their soul, they are speaking of the absolute light of consciousness diffusing within them and then being expressed outward through their talent or their actions or whatever it is they happen to do. Because the wand and what it evokes within us always leads to activity, always, which is why you see action symbols and action ideas tied to wands. But it's like zzz, like electrical. When Crawley draws them, he's giving you almost an electrified state, because he recognizes that the energy that we see and experience from the sun is ultimately electromagnetic, which means that it's ultimately an expression or form of living consciousness. It puts everything, the entire paradigm of living in life, in a completely new light, unintended. So, and that light is then conducted through the wand. So when I harvest a wand, I'm choosing an instrument that has already transmuted the light of the sun into something unique. And just like certain crystals, we'll get to that when we get to the earth element, just like certain crystals are good at attenuating certain forms of energy, so too certain woods are good at attenuating you and your personal energy. And that's something you're gonna have to discover on your own completely. It's without sounding a bit too pop culture-y, it is very Harry Potter-esque. If you're going on a wand search, you will be drawn to a particular kind of wood, a particular stain, a particular carving, a particular length, because it appeals to you, because a wand is designed to be a physical extension and expression of your will. That's what the wand is about. It is an extension or expression of your will. Your will without a wand can be expressed just fine. You have fingers and hands, that they're more than capable. But it's the difference between utilizing, let's say, a machete as opposed to a scalpel, right? With a wand, one can then focus their intent. They can focus their intent with an understanding that the structure of the wand relates to the structure of their own consciousness, right? So that ties together one to the other. And the best way to discover what kind of wood structure appeals to you is through no other way than to look at research through the eyes of folklore. Like, what is generally accepted as the significance of oak or willow or ash or mahogany, and why? And are they associated with any divinities? If they're associated with a divinity, then you can backtrack to the tree by looking at the "what job do I have" thing. And by what they do, by their work, then you will know them. So if it's a god of the hunt, then you know where to place that. If it's a god of, let's say, negotiation, then you know where to put that, or a god of war, obviously, you know where to go with that. These then can be placed by paralleling the instrument of that sphere. Technically, you could have many spheres or many wands, one for activity in each sphere, or you could choose a wand that's well conduced to working in all spheres. The truth of the matter is, because all wood is nourished by the sun, and the sun connects to all spheres, you should be able to use any wood you want in any sphere. Some are just more or less effective, that's all, given their nature, or what they're designed to do, or their strength, or how they conduct their life, or the length of their life, or the density of their material. Is it a softwood or a hardwood? So this is all tied in to the wand. And ultimately, then, the wand is a pale reflection or extension of the sun, which is a reflection or extension of the power that extends from Keter. So literally, it's the sun. It literally then is this: the sun here extends its power down through into Malkut, and we create for us, and there are created for us all the resources, all the elements are present here, and then we draw upon those elements as a means of engaging in the powers which exist above and outside of Malkut, right? Technically inside, but you get what I'm saying. That in other words, if we're within this sphere and I seek to move towards the next sphere, then the purpose of the wand can be as a means of articulating what I want. And that can be as simple as the preparatory work of drawing a circle with the wand, and as a means of defining the perimeter of your conscious effort. It also is a means, when one draws a circle, it creates a boundary that when the circle is broken, everything that was contained within it then can go out into the universe. Pop, goes out. And so you can build up a degree of energy, then break the circle and allow that energy to diffuse outward to do whatever it is that you wish to do. Oh, okay, good. Sent me an error message. I closed the screen share too soon. It was like, oh, screen share is closed. So, so that's wands. Now, let's take a look at cups. There we go. So cups is, again, one of these interesting circumstances, because you have to ask yourself, okay, why cups? Why would a cup be used to define water. There is the obvious answer. There's a great Bruce Lee quote. It's in black and white. He's being interviewed, and he's asked, what should be your philosophy? And anyway, he says, be water. He says, because water is a great example of malleability. Water can be hard, he says, or it can be soft. It can receive something or resist something, right? And it can, if you put water in a cup, it takes the form of a cup. You put water, whatever, it takes the form of whatever. I don't do Bruce Lee justice, I apologize, but you get the idea, right? That it needs to emphasize is be water because of its flexibility. That's really cool, but that's not like a cup is tied to water. It would seem like it would be, because just like with the wand, you can set it on fire, therefore it's tied to fire. With a cup, you can contain water, therefore water is tied to cups. But that's not the case. And this analogy begins to break down as we work farther through the elements, right? If it's this thing, because of that reason, so the real reason is because water is a container in and of itself. Water contains life, and water is also, so it functions as a container in that it suspends life. Water in its most favorable state to the things contained within it is considered a suspension. Water, when it's functioning in the form of transmutation, in that art, it's considered a solution. So it's breaking down, it's dissolving the things which are contained within it. Water is the ultimate solvent, which means that it is capable of the principle of polarity, because it can break things down into their constituent components. That's one of the functions. And then it can take that and it can suspend all of that and contain it. So the best way to think of water as a container is to think of a lake, an ocean, right? This is a body which has massive life on every level and scale contained within it. And that life that is within it cannot leave the water. It must always be contained within it. We, as air-breathing mammals, are still contained, as Star Trek puts it in one of the funnier episodes, in a bag of mostly water, right? So it's essentially, we're not water, we're all kinds of solution and all kinds of other things, but water more than certainly is a component of what we are. It allows us to transport and to contain nourishment. It allows us to have the systems in place for the communication of thoughts and ideas and the retention of memory and the expression of all of this. It's all contained within us. Water, therefore, is the chariot that goes no place but takes us every place. And that's why that card is seen entering into that system. As we look here, let's see, let me pull that up really quick. As we there we go. As we look at the tree, the sphere, which is the dominion of water, Binah, right? It is Mara, the great ocean of bitterness. It is that from that wellspring that the chariot then erupts and emerges. The chariot that is depicted by the Hebrew character that is the meaning of the word being fence, which implies a bifurcation, a separation, that the water simultaneously keeps things apart and together at the same time, right? that it provides an environment for creation to take place, a contained environment. And so the idea of a cup then is not a prison for the water. It's not the place wherein the water is. It simply represents symbolically what the water does for everything else, and how the water then provides itself also as a gateway, as the airlock, as the means by which we move from one system to another, always and ever contained by water. So, and that water is essential for every form of living and moving life on this planet. And so we are held captive by the necessity of our consumption of water, that without it, we would then cease to be. So it's the significance then of a cup within your working can take an entirely new light. A cup can represent something more than just an implement of containment. It can be an implement of creative expression and control. In Dune, the Fremen will say, "We hold your water within our cup," which means we've got you now, because for them, pardon me, for them, water represents the absolute facility for life to be maintained, right? So if you ever want to get a really good grasp on the symbolic and metaphoric and symbolic significance of water, then the Dune series, at least through the fourth book, is definitely an excellent place to go, because Frank Herbert exhaustively treats the nature of water and all of the elements that it represents by having a culture that is built up entirely around water and its scarcity. So yeah, if you want a really good series to read or listen to on Audible, I highly recommend it. So that brings us to the next symbol, swords. So the question is, again, now that we know that wands aren't wands because they burn, or cups aren't cups because they contain water, wands are wands because they are an expression of the source which creates the wand, right? And cups aren't cups because they contain, but because water, in fact, contains all things. It is the vessel in which all life is held. Well, then what about swords? Swords are tied to air, but what specifically does that mean? Is there an actual scientific explanation for all this? Like, if we look at it, can we sit there and go, okay, so obviously there's like an environmental reason for why these things are as they are. What then is the purpose of a sword? Well, it's nice to have the idea of a spade beneath it. And we had talked in that previous class on swords and spades. Briefly, the idea is that a spade is like a shovel. It's a means by which the earth can be parted. It can be pierced. It can be separated so that something may be placed within it and then contained within the earth. You find that the earth itself mirrors the containing principle of water. Right? It's just to a slower degree, but the earth also contains things and it also causes things to grow. The sword and its function goes back to the idea of metallurgy. Okay, this is why swords and metallurgy is one of the earliest forms of transmutation and alchemy. The idea of metallurgy and alchemy, they're sister skills entirely. Because the purpose of metallurgy mirrors the creative function of alchemy, from taking an element, applying heat to it so that you separate the element, and then gain what you want, purification of a mineral, which then can be combined with other things to create a new mineral called an alloy. So the sword represents then the idea of the purified metal and what a purified metal is capable of doing. Specifically, a purified metal is well adapted at conducting electricity. And electricity brings us right back to electromagnetism and consciousness. So the idea of a sword then is an expression, especially knowing that all swords have two edges, many of which are blunted, right? So that they allow the sword to parry something without breaking the blade, if that's what you wish, or to strengthen the blade itself, right? The edge of the blade, it'll have the blunted edge, right? The other swords will have two edges. The one depicted here has two edges. Ceremonially, our focus would be a sword or blade with two edges. This ties back to the idea that consciousness and the expression of consciousness can both bless and curse something at exactly the same time. So it can, the same sword that can be used to behead a man or a woman can be used to knight the person by striking them lightly on one shoulder, then the other. This is often, anciently, you'd be doing a V cut because cutting through the neck is often very hard. So they'd go through the clavicle down like this, chunk, chunk, and then the head just kind of comes off. Talking, yeah, horrible way to die. When you get knighted, that's a ceremonial tapping on the shoulder, this, and then you're knighted, right? In the name of St. Paul and St. Michael and St. George, you're boom. Now you're a knight of the Victorian Order. What this means is that you now have been set apart. You've been inducted. You've been removed from one status or station and brought to another. This is an idea of polarization that is expressed within the element of air. Air gives us the sense of separation. The best way to visualize this is the Egyptian depiction of the god Nut, Shu, and Geb. And boy, if I could just find that, that would be the most awesome thing ever. Let's see here. Are you guys familiar with what I'm talking about? You know what, I'm just going to look it up right here. I bet you I can find it super quick. Yeah. Okay. Images. Yep, there we go. All right, so we're going to just pull this image right up like this, and we will stop sharing the one screen, and we will start sharing this screen. Okay, so this is Nut. She represents the heavens and eternity. Shu represents her father. He's also the element of air, and he separates her from her husband, Geb, who's just leisurely kind of kicking back on the ground. He represents Earth. So in Egyptian mythology, Earth is masculine aspected. It makes sense when you kind of recognize that the function of Earth, while it is receptive, if you live within an agrarian society, you're watching things project out of the earth, which you then later consume. So the projections that come from the earth could then be seen as masculine aspected as they're rising back towards the sun. And since they observed how plants would then move and change toward the sun, they recognize this flow of energy. This is also another idea behind the wand, that the wand is in its original state as a plant tied to the electromagnetic input of the sun, so it will follow the sun around, right, as it's growing. I have a lot of plants in my office, so I have regularly need to turn them, or they'll all just grow one way, right? And it's because they're growing towards the light. The wand represents that connection, and so it's growing towards the light. When we look at swords, we're looking at something that creates separation. So the idea of air is depicted here by the god Shu, okay? And Shu is separating the heavens, and notice the heavens are filled with starlight, stars, sunlight, right? It's separating that from the earth. And we do this when we look at the nature of what the additional nature of the element that is used to make a sword, the metals which are used to create and make a sword, and how they conduct electricity. It's fascinating. The electricity runs generally along the surface of the blade. It doesn't necessarily go inside. It runs along like water. And that's also with your cables and things like that. So it's running along that, and how do I explain this? That idea of electricity as consciousness becomes meaningful when we recognize that the same kind of impulse reactive feature of our brain as neurons are communicating to each other is a reflection of input which is coming in from the outside. I personally believe that. Like your thoughts, they're here, but there have been numerous studies which have shown that cognitively you're already thinking often before a question is asked in relation to it, even if you don't know a question's coming. Like some of these studies are absolutely fascinating, where the brain seems to be connected, the mind seems to be connected to a great deal more. I believe it's this field consciousness that we all reside within. And I believe that the access point to that field consciousness resides within an understanding of the element of metal. That when you look at the Eastern idea of the five elements, metal or steel is often placed at the top of the pentagram, where we would hold spirit, because the idea is that metal is conductive of the spirit, that charge of electricity that comes from your outlet and can zap you, that is the physical force of electromagnetic force running into you, and it's conducted through the metal. When we look at it as an expression of air, then we see that force being conducted through the atmosphere as a lightning strike. So, and it's through the air that is conducted. Once it hits water, it diffuses. Once it hits the ground, it's grounded, but it maintains its shape, its continuity, its width and distance consistently from top to bottom as the strike is maintained. So that is a physical expression. When we think then one step more with the idea of swords, it becomes an expression of language, because of the fact that through language we create ideas which essentially float in the atmosphere until they are received and absorbed by another human being. Other than that, they're just kind of there, but the idea itself remains consistent and will differentiate itself from other ideas as a product of the polarization that can be seen in the blading aspect of the sword. So the last element that we're looking at and is pentacles, is earth. And I like how I mentioned this in the previous video on spades. I've always enjoyed the idea that we use a diamond to describe the element of earth. And the reason for that is because it gives you a sense that our first response within Malkuth is resistance. And that we have a barrier set up that repels input, energetic input that is from the outside. that is outside of ourselves, and that only through the application of the other three elements are we ever penetrated. So the sword parts the ground of your heart or your mind, right? The sword as a spade parts the ground. The cup contains the information, the idea, the concept, the state of mind, the degree to which your will wishes to be formed. And that is placed within the space created by the spade. And then those two elements combined are then heated by the wand. It is a reverse of the yod he vav he. It's a he vav he yod. It's a process of meditative ascension. And if you work your working and the language of your working and structure it in such a way so that each of these elements address a particular point of your work, right? They represent a different leg or of the table or standard or pillar, of your edifice. Each one represents a different concept, but all together represent everything that you're seeking to achieve. So does that make sense? Yes, I should ask you guys, how are we doing? Does that make sense?
Perfect sense.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
With you.
Excellent. So it essentially then what I'm trying to do is give you the foundation so that when you're working your magic, whatever you are spelling, right? Which the idea of a pen and a sword, right, being carried as synonymous, meaning that a pen can function in the place of a sword and is often considered, as the saying goes, mightier than the sword, right? So the reason for this is the pen as an implement. I'm talking classically, with the little blade on the end. It is holding and conveying the liquid of water, and then placing that by scratching on the surface of the parchment, leaving the impression of the consciousness, of the thought. It's metaphorically, you can use I've used a pen as a wand. And so the pen can supply itself, the wood of the pen supplies itself as the wand structure, and then the tip is the blade, right? Because it has two edges with the little thing in the middle. So, and then the blade can draw and contain the liquid. And then you can write your spell. You can write your whatever it is, your affirmation. This is what I wish to see happen. It's my will to do this. There's something significant about taking the time and creating that, and then observing your thoughts be written by your hand in front of your eyes, like as a meditation, to take your time with each character as you're writing it down, and contemplate what it is that you seek. This could be done by writing it once, and then when you're doing the work itself, then writing it the second time from the source material, allowing you to be accurate and to contemplate things at the same time. Otherwise, I get lost. I'll be writing and then I forget what I was writing about because I'm meditating on or something, like just, meditating on that. So anyway, that about covers it. I think we've covered the ground, and this should provide you like what you need. Recognize that when we look at Earth, we're still looking at water. That's why it contains something. That's why it's a hay. We're just looking at a lower frequency, a lower vibratory state of what water already is. So it's a repetition. When we look at swords, that's why the pen and the idea of fusing the tip of a pen as the sword bonded with a wand gives me two aspects of the sacred masculine in one thing, allowing me then to spell, you know, in written form. So and that's honestly, you guys, that's really, there's some beef there, like that you know, in German there's some Macht, some might, and in knowing these things, and in knowing that to hold a cup and perhaps ceremoniously then placing a wine which you have consecrated, right? And consecration is something where you set it apart. You don't need to be a priest or something. You simply have to say, this is no longer for general consumption. I consecrate, I set this apart for only this purpose. That's consecration. So I go to a area where I'm going to dig holes and put dead people. I consecrate that ground as a graveyard. That is all that ground is for now, putting dead people in it. It's been consecrated. Same with the church, right? It's a church now. It's not anything else. It's a church, and the ground is consecrated. So in the same sense, you can consecrate an activity. You can consecrate a period of time and call it a devotional, okay, where you are setting aside, okay, from 3 o'clock to 3:30, I will be in meditation focusing on insert blank. And I'm consecrating that time for only that purpose. It's remarkable how effective doing something like that can be. It doesn't have to be for long periods. Honestly, 30 minutes can be an eternity these days. There's just so much demand on our time. I know my time, like 30 minutes, man, that's threshold right there. If I can get a full 60, wow. But 30, and plus the 30 is a nice round number. Like the 3, it brings you back to that. You can separate your 30-minute meditation into 3 10-minute periods, if you're staying focused, and 10 minutes is, again, can be an eternity, especially if you're focused. So, but that's the idea of consecration. And each of the elements that you choose, each of these symbols, they should be consecrated. If they're part of your altar or part of your toolbox, I've had a magical toolbox. I put it in a fishing tackle box. It was awesome. I had everything. That way I could just take it with me if someone needed something. And then I had it all to go. It was like my little doctor kit, but it had all the stuff I needed. And as long as the stuff in there is never used for anything other than that, then that's okay. Now, I've been asked this question. I'll wrap up with this. What about knives? Because there are a ton of Wiccans out there that will use their athame in the kitchen. And does that violate consecration? And my thought is, technically, no. If you're meditating while cooking, because cooking is a transformative process, so you can be seen, for me, as in meditation, as I go through and I like dice things up. I've never actually used my athame though, because it's my athame and it just didn't feel right. But I can see people doing that. I've had those special knives that I use in the kitchen that I consider consecrated for the purpose of, don't use my knife or I'm going to hurt you. No, I'm just kidding. But I've never actually because but you can do it. It's just, I always think my question is, what about cheese? You're cutting the cheese, now you smeared it on the side of your sacred blade, and then you got to wipe that off. And I don't know. You can do it. It's not like a violation. It's I always like it seems like a Pharisee question to me, like when Jesus is going through the fields and he gets criticized because he's allowing his guys to glean from the fields on the Sabbath, which is forbidden. And then the Pharisees are all like, hey, you're a bad person because they're gleaning and they're eating. And he's like, it's not what goes in your mouth, but what comes out that defiles you. And that's true for all of this too. It's how you approach what you're doing, and then the expression of what you've done is what sanctifies or defiles you, right? By your fruit, you'll know yourself, and anyone else for that matter. Well, sweet guys, that's it for today's Essentials of Practical Magic. Thank you for joining me.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great.
It
Awesome.
was. Second that. Well done.
Well, thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Aubrey.
I will
Talk to you
talk to
later.
you soon. Bye.
Bye bye.